Welcome to IFA. I fix everything.
Today's project is to repair a coolant leak on a 1986 Pontiac Fiero GT. The most common source of coolant leaks is loose hose clamps. As hoses degrade, they shrink and the clamps begin to loosen. The coolant leak appears to be coming from the vicinity of the water pump. The most common source of water pump leaks is the gaskets. Another source of water pump leak is the impeller shaft bearing. This could be brought on by age or an over-tensioned fan belt. With the engine running, the commotion on the front of the motor makes it difficult to pinpoint the source of the leak. A safe, effective way to find the source of the leak is to pressurize the system with air. The first step in any under-the-hood maintenance is to disconnect the negative battery cable. I'm removing the map sensor to gain access to the cooling line. The 38-year-old vacuum lines are brittle and must be handled carefully while disconnecting the map sensor. I'm going to pressurize the system through a throttle body cooling line. To disconnect the seated cooling line without damage, I'm soaking it with penetrating oil. I unseated the cooling hose by inserting a small flat blade screwdriver around the periphery of the tube. This close-up shows the rust formed on the tube from the water-based coolant. I employed spark plug boot pulling pliers to press the cooling line free from the tube. I plugged the line with a bolt and clamped it at the smooth shank to prevent air leakage through the threads. Next, I clamped a clear plastic tube to the steel coolant line. After checking my radiator cap pop-off pressure, I lowered the pressure regulator on my air compressor to 14 psi. I pressurized the system with air and used a mirror and a flashlight to inspect around the water pump and around the different hoses and connections for water leaks. I wasn't able to pinpoint it on camera, but the source of the leak was a faulty water pump. I purchased this water pump from Rock Auto. I inserted this photograph out of sequence so you can see the tools, supplies, and the water pump that you're going to be removing. This is what I call the operating table. It was formed with a piece of plywood and a quilted moving blanket. It's a comfortable work surface while you're approaching the engine from the back of the car. The next step is to drain the coolant. Ethylene glycol is the most common form of antifreeze. It's toxic and sweet and can attract small children and animals. Antifreeze collects the wear metals from the running engine. It's unsafe to dispose of it in a sanitary sewer. After draining the antifreeze, store it in a closed container prior to disposal. With the antifreeze drained, it's time to begin removing the water pump. To give myself more elbow room to work, I removed the battery and the plastic baffle. Next, I removed the EGR control valve to prevent damage and allow more clearance. With the EGR removed, I have more access to the water line hose clamp. Rust and age has seated the hose to the nipple. I gripped the hose where the hose clamp was seated. This is the area where the bond is the strongest. Once the seat was broken, I was able to twist the hose by hand and press it up to remove it. It's easier if you remove the bolts from the water pump pulley prior to removing the belt. I use the tension on the alternator belt as a clamp. I shock the wrench with a hammer and break the bolts free. Here's a clamping method I use to torque the pulley bolts. The water pump is held in place with two sizes of bolts, a large mounting bolt and a small clamping bolt. Two of the large mounting bolts beneath the oil pressure sensor are stud head bolts. It's considerably easier to remove the pulley prior to removing the 5 small clamping bolts. When the engine is dirty and greasy, it's easy to overlook one of the bolts. If you have a new water pump on hand, place the bolts in the holes, and when the holes are full, you're finished. I began by removing the metal bracket beneath the oil pressure sensor. The two stud head bolts have a larger head size than the other mounting bolts. Notice the oil on the large mounting bolts that screw into the timing cover. These must be thoroughly cleaned prior to reinstallation. The EGR control module bracket is held in place with one small bolt. I place this photo so you can see the location and pattern of the large and small bolts around the periphery of the pump. I remove the large mounting bolts first in a circular pattern using a 3/8 inch ratchet. I am now removing the small clamping bolts with a 1/4 inch ratchet. It's easier if you remove the water pump pulley prior to removing the clamping bolts. This bolt was being held in place with the sealant, so I used an Automotive trim tool to remove it. Some of the clamping bolts are hidden away under the pulley. Rust and age has seated the pulley to the hub. I removed it with a pry bar from behind. Now I can access the last of the clamping bolts. The last bolt was hidden deep in a cavity below the pulley hub. I regret that I didn't highlight the timing mark when I had the water pump removed. The Fiero engine is transverse mounted. Cleaning the gasket surface is challenging. The water pump gasket surface is made of aluminum, and care must be taken to prevent gouges that will cause leaks. I removed the bulk of the material with a painter's 5-in-1 tool. Then I switched to mineral spirits and Scotch-Brite to remove the baked-on gasket material. I even had some stubborn areas that required steel wool. Razor blades and wire brushes should not be used. This view of the gasket surface was taken from the mechanic's perspective. It shows how difficult it is to see if the surface is cleaned properly. This close-up of the water pump gasket mating surface shows it needs additional cleaning to remove the residual gasket material. The photograph allows me to determine when the gasket surface is ready to reinstall a new water pump. Another close-up photograph of the most difficult area of the gasket mating surface. Pay close attention to the bolt holes. That's the most prominent area for leaks. When I was finished, I sprayed the area with engine degreaser and let it soak in. Then I rinsed it down with a spray bottle and used an air gun to blow it dry. I wiped the area down with a clean white cloth to be sure that I had removed all the residue. To remove the rust from the bolts, I chucked them into a hand drill and applied them against the counter-rotating brush on a bench grinder. I also clamped the head of the bolts with vice grips and burnished the threads. The new water pump comes without the pipe nipple. I soaked the nipple with Lennox tapping oil. It's designed for cutting threads, but I found it to be the best penetrating oil for removing rusted parts. With the water pump clamped in a jaw horse, I clamped the nipple with a pair of Milwaukee locking pliers. They have a very firm grip and they release very comfortably without the characteristic snap of some of the others. It's back to the wire wheel to clean up the threads and to remove the corrosion from the pipe flare. I burnished the shank also. While I was at the wire wheel, I decided to clean the V-grooves of the pulley to remove any rust or embedded grit. If you needed to test your water pump prior to removal, this method works very well. I decided the best way to demonstrate the worn impeller shaft bearings was to clamp 2 wrenches to the hub and place a microphone so you could hear the bearing slop. The water pump was sealed with a hexagon plug. My first attempt was with a large Allen key. Second, I tried with a ratcheting box wrench. This was a very stubborn plug. To get some extra leverage, I grabbed a Ford wrench. The pliers I'm using to open the can are from the plumbing department. They're used for the PVC pipe cement. This is the pipe thread sealant I used for the water line nipple and the bolts. If you saw my well pump video, you'll know that this is some great stuff, but it has one drawback. It does not come out of your clothes. This sealant contains Teflon that allows the pipe to thread more easily. So I started it by hand and snugged it with a pair of locking pliers. Next step was to clean the gasket surface of the water pump with denatured alcohol to ensure a good seal. To seal the water pump gasket, I chose Permatex Ultra Gray. It's specifically designed for water pumps. I applied Permatex to the complete lower gasket face. Then I aligned the gasket with the mounting holes and pressed it firmly in place. Then I spread sealant across the top mating surface. Lastly, I took alcohol and cleaned the contaminated areas. I did a final inspection on the water pump mating surface. I held the pump temporarily in place with 3 or 4 bolts to ensure everything was properly aligned. I screwed in all the bolts and seated the gasket so the sealing process could begin. Then I removed each mounting bolt one at a time and applied thread sealer to the mounting bolts. Because the gasket was fully seated, the thread sealer was unable to leave the bolt holes and contaminate the gasket surface. Remember to reinstall the stud head bolts beneath the oil pressure sensor. Install the small clamping bolts and torque in a circular pattern to 7 foot-pounds. I torqued the mounting bolts to 22 foot-pounds following the arched pattern of the water pump, starting at the center and alternating left to right. This will spread the load evenly from the center out, like pressing the wrinkles out of a blanket. The nuts are also 22 foot-pounds. I need to loosen the alternator adjustment locking bolt to install the belt. If the alternator does not want to rotate, loosen the upper pivot bolt slightly. Place the water pump pulley on the hub and install all 4 bolts before tightening. I find it's easier to install the belt on the alternator pulley first. Pivot the alternator to get the slack necessary to install the belt on the water pump. Tension the alternator by levering a bar between the alternator housing and the bracket. Now tighten the tension lock bolt and snug the pivot bolt. A squeeze clamp applied to the water pump pulley and the belt provided enough tension to allow me to torque the water pump pulley bolts. The torque specifications is 13 to 18 foot-pounds in a crisscrossed pattern. I reinstalled the small cooling line and tightened the clamp. I mended a broken plastic vacuum line with a piece of rubber tubing cut to length. I reconnected the map sensor vacuum lines and installed the mounting bolts. Next, I reconnected the EGR solenoid electrical connection and vacuum lines and mounted it to the bracket above the water pump. I let the gasket and thread sealer fully cure for a minimum of 24 hours. To remove the thermostat housing cover, I found it's easiest to use the same oil filter strap wrench I use for the oil change. If the thermostat is seated, I even use the handle of the wrench to pop it free. The jar on the left is a sample of the coolant that was removed from the car prior to the water pump. After the water pump was complete, I filled the system completely with clear water and ran the engine to operating temperature. The sample on the right is a boiled rinse of the cooling system. It shows just how much contaminated antifreeze remains in the system if you do not do a pressurized drain. I improvised a pressurized draining system using nothing more than a rubber glove and a couple rubber bands. I pulsed the air pressure to flush the system and remove any hard contaminants. I ran the engine to operating temperature following the instructions on the bottle. The third sample on the right was the result of the coolant flush. Once again, I pressure drained the system and filled it with clear water. I ran the engine to operating temperature and I pressure drained the rinse water, expecting it to be clear. I was completely in shock when I found heavy residue in the bottom of the rinse water. The bottle with the green cap is the second rinse after the coolant flush. It's still cloudy but contains no sediment. The matching bottle with the green cap is the third rinse. The final bottle is completely clear. It took 4 complete rinse cycles running the engine to operating temperature and pressure draining the system. If you enjoyed this video, stay tuned for more. I have an upcoming Fiero battery tray replacement video for those with a corroded battery tray. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below. Subscribers are always welcome.